Story 1. When you can look back and think, that wasn't a good relationship if she didn't want me, and laugh about it. Story 2. When I stopped crying at the thought of him, when I stopped crying myself to sleep, when his presence stopped turning me into a wreck of emotions, when I stopped waiting for closure, when I stopped wondering why he did it, and when, after months, I finally felt like myself and smiled once more. Story 3. When I felt embarrassed about the silly things I said to try to win her back, I still cringe thinking about it. Story 4. When their name appeared on my feed, I didn't feel like throwing my phone in a lake or composing a lengthy essay in my head. I just scrolled past, and that was it. Story 5. When my perspective of them changed, I no longer had a love filter over my eyes, and I could see them for who they actually are. It's not good. Story 6. When I saw her a month later, we got together, and I realized she had just cheated on her new boyfriend, the same guy she had cheated on me with. I knew then it wasn't me at all. Story 7. When I started seeing all the lies he created as mildly funny stories, rather than moments that undermined my sense of reality. Story 8. When I no longer held ill will towards her. I am not exactly rooting for her, but I am indifferent to how her life unfolds. Story 9. When I stopped feeling mad about her cheating, lying, and leading me on, I realized she tried to set me up for no reason with guys who were part of my writing crew. Took about 8 years to get over her, but we managed. I promised myself that if I was still mad after 10 years, we would resolve it. Fortunately, I never went to prison, so all is well. Story 10. When I healed my relationship with food and overcame my eating disorders, I no longer felt bad about my body and started to adopt healthier eating habits. Story 11. When I realized how our relationship truly was, it took me months to understand why he ended things unexpectedly. I cried as I tried to make sense of everything. Eventually, I received a response, and I saw him for who he really was, not a good person to the woman he claimed to love. In that moment, I felt a huge burden lift off my shoulders, allowing me to begin healing. Story 12. I'm currently in the stage of wanting him back, so I'm not healed, and I don't know if I ever will be after this breakup. Story 13. When I could meet another person and not feel guilty for betraying my previous partner or lying to a new one. Story 14. When I received an apology email from him, I saw the subject line and almost deleted it. However, I opened it and read the first line. I stopped right there and deleted it without reading the rest because I realized I just didn't care anymore. Story 15. When the third appeal was denied, there was no way he could keep his promise to kill me. Story 16. When I realized not only does this person not want me, but this person also hates me. Wait a minute, I like myself. That was the moment. Story 17. My signal is that I stopped looking at my phone often and no longer yearn for their presence. I have become so accustomed to being single and enjoy it so much that it is relatively easy for me to prefer that over being in a relationship. Story 18. When I couldn't remember the last time I thought about him or anything that reminded me of him, I felt completely apathetic when people mentioned them or reminded me of them. Story 19. I randomly thought about it one day and noticed a lack of emotion arising from the thought of her. It was striking. Story 20. When we broke up, I still loved him but knew he wasn't right for me. I journaled all the things he did in our relationship that made me feel bad. Now, when I feel lonely and miss him, I just reread my journal. I'm not quite over him, but I'm getting there. Story 21. When I can openly discuss the abuse I experienced without having a panic attack, I still feel fear towards anyone who resembles my ex, worried about being beaten or verbally abused in public again. Story 22. You know, not all breakups are unwanted. The ones you have to initiate yourself for your own sanity are easier to move on from. Sometimes, no healing is necessary. The feeling of freedom from the pain is quite uplifting. Story 23. Divorce is not a regular breakup. She got remarried less than a week after it was finalized. That part didn't bother me so much. But then, a little under a year later, I was in Las Vegas with my then-girlfriend, now wife, when she started texting me about how her husband at the time had filed a restraining order against her and served her with divorce paperwork. She was going through a mental health crisis and wanted to end things. I knew I was over it, but when she reached out while we were married, I was always there for her. When she contacted me that time, I said, "Oh, that's unfortunate," and then sent her pictures of my girlfriend and me having a great time in Las Vegas, saying, "I'm busy having a good time. Can't deal with your drama." I realized it was petty and probably shouldn't have responded, but we shared a child for whom she had partial legal custody, so I couldn't completely cut off communication. After all she put me through, it gave me a sense of satisfaction to know that my life was going great without her while hers was still filled with drama, even with different people. Story 24. When I no longer felt sad and didn't care what they were doing or about the thought of them finding someone else. Story 25. When I spoke to him again after some time, I felt nothing. I wondered why I had cried over him so much. Story 26. I no longer feel anxious about checking their social media. I look at their profiles to see their growth instead of stalking. Story 27. I used to see a woman who looked a lot like my ex at the train station platform during my commute. Naturally, I found her attractive, and she reminded me of my ex daily. One day, I arrived at the station a little earlier and saw her being dropped off by a man. They shared a big smile and a kiss goodbye. I thought, of course she has a boyfriend. She's gorgeous. Then I considered my ex and reasoned that she, too, would have a new boyfriend now. Someone who makes her smile and gives her a kiss goodbye in the morning. Why wouldn't she? She deserves to be loved. From that point on, my heart was happy to let go. Story 28. When I went months or a year without checking their social media, even though there was some interesting content, the idea of never seeing them, talking to them, or having any interaction for the rest of my life didn't bother me. I stopped feeling angry about what they did. I also found that when I finally remembered them, I realized I had forgotten they existed for a while. Story 29. At a certain point, reflecting on some of her quirks that I initially found endearing, I began to see them as annoying. She was a sweet girl, and I wish her the best, hoping she has learned and grown from her mistakes. However, she hurt me deeply. Once I started dating my wife, I realized this is how things should be, and my ex essentially faded from my thoughts. Story 30. When I could listen to songs, I used to strongly associate them with feelings of joy, without experiencing sadness or anger. I could simply enjoy the music. Story 31. I had been with my first boyfriend from age 17 to 21, so when we broke up, I felt like my life was over and was terrified of being alone. This fear made me think I still wanted to be with him. One evening, I went to see a movie with my parents where the main character briefly visits Italy, and his life undergoes significant changes. I left the theater realizing I had my entire life ahead of me and so much was going to happen. I suddenly realized I didn't love my ex-boyfriend anymore, and I felt excited about the opportunities that lay ahead. Story 32. When you realize how foolish it is to think about someone who does not think about you at all. Story 33. When I started to lean more into my joy, strangers would approach me and be friendly. Kids would look up and smile at me. Everyone was just brighter and friendlier to me all of a sudden. That was a huge hint because it immediately told me that I was no longer walking around in a depressive state. There was clearly something in my energy that drew people to me, so I continued embracing that, which turned into spontaneously dancing in my kitchen and recording myself doing so. Just full of pure joy. Joy found its way back to me. I started creating. I began painting, and I'm not even a painter. I started freestyle dancing around my apartment. I played lighter, more upbeat songs on my guitar. I became much friendlier and more outgoing, completely unafraid to be myself around strangers and people I didn't know well. I became unfiltered, but in the best way, if that makes sense. Most importantly, when a friend of mine is gushing about how in love they are, I don't feel that piercing sadness anymore. No jealousy, anger, or pity. I simply smile and remind myself for a few moments what it was like to be that in love, think of him just for a moment, and then move along. Sometimes I do get sad about it, of course, but I can now tell the difference between grieving the breakup and experiencing pure, desperate, unbearable heartbreak. Grief is okay. I expect it, but it doesn't stifle me anymore. Story 34. When I stopped crying in the shower every day, it only happens now during my period or when I see babies. So yes, I'm totally great. Story 35. When I separated from my ex-wife of 17 years, I started writing a letter to vent. It was never intended to be sent. I poured all the betrayal I felt into it, expressing all the things I had never said during our marriage. I didn't allow myself to admit these feelings until it was over. The letter was saved in a file on my phone. I would go back and add to it periodically whenever I felt the need, after processing some new realization or encountering a new twist in the divorce process. One day, I realized I hadn't written it in a while, so I checked the date. It had been a year and a day since I had last updated it. I printed out the letter and deleted all copies. I rolled it up and put it through my wedding ring to hold it while I burned the letter to ashes. I then threw the ring into the river. Story 36. The first time I released a spontaneous, joyful giggle was when I did not trip over clothes on the floor while going to the window in the morning. After that, I began counting the good things in my new single life. Story 37. When you can talk about him without getting angry, it's just indifferent from now on. There is no use getting angry at an ex who was never going to change. Story 38. Quando ho iniziato ad andare a letto con qualsiasi ragazza osasse sorridermi. Per fortuna in quella estate ero tutti i giorni in un posto diverso e suonavo con una banda musicale. Capitava spesso che le ragazze del luogo si buttassero su qualcuno di noi e molte volte capitavo io. Ero ancora decente 15 anni fa. Queste esperienze con altre ragazze e il continuo condividere il mio tempo con amici mi hanno fatto totalmente dimenticare di lei. Story 39. 1. Feeling indifferent. You are thankful for the lessons learned. You begin to find other people attractive, both physically and mentally. Story 40. I will let you know if it ever happens. Seriously, I healed a long time ago when I accepted the fact that some of the trauma will be with me forever. It makes for funny stories years later, and I'm in better shape and a better person now. Looking back, I wonder how I was so naive to stay for so long. Story 41. When I became indifferent toward her, I initially felt a lot of anger and seething rage at the injustice done to me by the one I trusted the most. Then, on a random day, I became indifferent. It was as if she could drop dead or become someone else's problem, and I still wouldn't bat an eye. Story 42. I am not going to say I am completely over him, maybe 95%, but I am fine with that. He was an important part of my life, and it definitely left a mark, and that is okay. I knew I was moving on when I started to enjoy my alone time. After we broke up, I could barely stand to walk into an empty apartment. I began doing things because I was genuinely excited about them, not just to pass the time. I also managed not to reply to his texts. Finally, I could imagine myself with someone new and even like someone new for a while. Took well over a year to get there. Story 43. I saw them again with someone else, and I felt nothing. Additionally, I was in love with someone else. I never thought I would ever move on. Story 44. Healed from the relationship just a few months after leaving it behind. Healed from the toxic behaviors after being single for 3 years, meeting someone new, and realizing that much of what I expected from dating was actually detrimental and had been instilled in me through manipulation. Story 45. The moment I realized I wasn't thinking about her. Instead of actively trying not to think about her, I was at the point where I had to actively think about her, if that makes sense. It suddenly hit me that she hadn't crossed my mind all day, and I realized that I had healed. Story 46. I ran into an ex-boyfriend a few years ago at a concert. He broke my heart when I was 19. I had issues in later relationships because of him. I didn't even recognize his face, but I recognized his tattoo sleeve. At that moment, I knew I could let that anger go. Story 47. It's a long story, but I'll keep it brief. When I was younger, I allowed him to buy a bicycle using my credit card, with the agreement that he would make monthly payments to me while I paid off the card. He was unable to get a card himself, and this arrangement allowed him to get his bike while I built my credit. To his credit, he made all his payments on time, but we broke up before he finished paying it off. I told him I would keep the bike until he settled the balance, which upset him, but he agreed. Later, I discovered he had lied about many aspects of his life. He didn't sell his car to improve his situation. It had been repossessed. His ex was not preventing him from seeing his children. He simply wasn't making an effort to do so. He claimed he was in the army, but it wasn't active combat as he implied. He had only served as a police officer on a civilian base for about 2 months. I'm not discounting that job, but he made it seem like he had extensive experience and had been involved in combat. When he finally paid off the bike, we discussed how I would get it to him. I realized that since there was no written agreement, the bike was legally mine. I could have kept it, sold it, or demanded more money if I wanted to. Ultimately, I recognized that I had moved on and didn't care about him anymore, so I gave him the bike. Story 48. Thoughts of her changed from being bittersweet to more of a sentiment of, it was nice, but we've moved on. Story 49. I'm not fully healed from my breakup, but it's better than a year ago. It used to occupy my mind a lot, but not as much these days. I tried dating apps again and went through a series of unsuccessful first dates. It hurt to hear people say they weren't interested or to get ghosted, but the breakup was still the most painful experience. Time helped heal the wound, and I'm very fortunate to be in a relationship with someone new who is a refreshing change from my ex. Nowadays, the thoughts running through my mind are about date and activity plans, thinking of a future with her, and ways I can improve myself both physically and mentally. Story 50. A man asked me for money at a tram station. I said that I don't carry cash and I was sorry. He told me it was fine and that one thing which had bothered me for a long time would be gone. He slipped from my sight, and I immediately turned around, only to find myself completely alone in an area where you can't hide in 2 seconds. I had thought of her every day for 7 years, but since that day, I rarely did. Just like that, I was over it and had a surreal experience as well. Story 51. When I was finally able to listen again to the music I used to play during the relationship, the music suggested by my former partner, or our music. Story 52. What does it mean if, after a 2-year relationship, I don't feel sad after we broke up? Feels like nothing has changed in my life, and I feel exactly the same. I sensed I had checked out of the relationship before the actual breakup 1 month ago. Maybe that's why. Story 53. When I started forgetting what I had been angry about in the first place, I used to have a list of grievances I could easily recall. Now I remember it was long, but the specifics are fading. Story 54. When I think about them at times, I realize how little I mattered to them. It has been years, and I still think about them at night, even though I am in a happy relationship. Story 55. When I see her social media posts, I feel pity for her. I am glad we are not together. She was a toxic positive person, interested in astrology, futurology, and the manifestation of wealth. Note to self. She did not manifest wealth. She manifested a single motherhood life, living in a poor rental situation. You can't just manifest a solid life. You have to work hard for it. Story 56. I could have intimacy without feeling like it was cheating. I did not cheat during the relationship, but I did during the first few hookups afterward. Felt like I was. Story 57. When I started doing things for myself instead of for someone else, it was exhausting to constantly try to please someone who didn't accept me for who I am. It turns out I made some wonderful friends who accept me once I became comfortable being my true self. I admit I wasn't the best partner in that relationship. I suppressed a lot of feelings, which made me angrier and lonelier, and I struggled to cope in a healthy way. However, going through that ordeal helped me realize there are people who love me for who I am, and over time, I began to accept myself. Story 58. When hearing their name no longer made my stomach churn, I realized it wasn't a healthy relationship. He was abusive in several ways. Story 59. When I stopped hating him and listened to his problems, I actually gave advice on his new girlfriends. I introduced him to my best friend and was the maid of honor at their wedding. There are no bad feelings whatsoever. We are still all friends. Story 60. I remember when I was in high school, I was completely devastated that my girlfriend broke up with me. I would jump at any opportunity she gave me to talk to her. One day, she was trying to start an argument with me on a messaging platform, and I ended the conversation because I had just finished laundry and needed to hang my clothes up in the closet. It wasn't until I was in the middle of it that I realized what had happened. Felt nice. I also gained insight that there are times when you feel like everything is crashing down on you after a breakup, but there is a light at the end of the tunnel. It will eventually end. While it may not stop you from feeling depressed, it's something to hold on to while you're down. Story 61. When the thought of her no longer makes me feel sad and instead irritates me. I wouldn't say I've healed entirely, but I've healed enough to have moved on and no longer be invested in anything related to her. I still have some resentment for the damage she caused me financially and emotionally, but ultimately, my life is better off now. Story 62. It's not over until you pick up the phone. You say, "I don't love you anymore." They respond, "I don't love you anymore either." You reply, "Great. I'll pick you up in 20 minutes. Let's grab a scone." Story 63. When I became really sick and realized days later that I hadn't thought about calling him once, I knew I could move on. Story 64. Once the thought of them being with someone else didn't matter anymore, it was indifference. That's when you know it's over. Story 65. To think about them rarely, and when you do, you feel nothing, no hate or regret. Not a single emotion. Story 66. Technically, it wasn't a breakup, but I was able to clearly separate my feelings from what actually happened. I spent time analyzing what was my fault, what I needed to take responsibility for, and most importantly, what changes I needed to make to avoid repeating the same mistakes. I realized that I had moved on after that. Story 67. Remember that overcoming grievances takes time, and the duration depends on how quickly you start the healing process. Everyone heals differently, so there is never a set time frame. Accept the difficult emotions, and once you do, you can begin to move on and heal. Story 68. Before we broke up, I thought we had no contact with my parents. When my minimal Facebook user mom befriended her new girlfriend, I realized that they were both disrespectful instead of contacting either of them. I knew I was truly free. Story 69. I have never healed from any breakup. I keep carrying the emotional baggage around, and it is starting to make me physically sick. Story 70. When I stopped feeling hateful or angry towards him, I began to see how ordinary he was without my love. Thanks a bunch for sticking around till the end of the video. Remember to subscribe, and until next time, stay awesome and goodbye.